I'm standing here today above Plymouth Hoe between the citadel and the water, and this wall would have been part of the old fort started in 1592. You can imagine a soldier standing up here on duty looking out to sea and looking over to the left to that lump of rock. And before the Civil War and during the Civil War, that area was called Sturt Point. But later, it became known as Mount Batten. Not because of Louis Mountbatten, that a lot of people associate with this area and the name, but because of a man called Captain William Batten, who served here during the Civil War. That tower was not there during the Civil War. Right, we've come over to Mountbatten Peninsula now. If I was stood here in the 1640s, I'd be in the sea because this wasn't built much later. Mountbatten Peninsula ended there by that White House, the rocks just in front. And the rock where the tower is built on sloped down more on either side. If you look at it from here, the tower, it's a Martello tower actually, you get a different perspective. From over on the Hoe where we stood before in front of the citadel, it looks like the tower is on the very top of the hill. But from down below, from this area, it's on the left of the hill. It's not on the top of the hill at all. From this side, it looks like it's protecting the entrance to the harbour and the catwater. Okay, we've just come up from the seafront and you can see the tower in the distance over there, several hundred yards away. It just confuses me why they wouldn't have built it here if it was for the protection of the coast. But being over there to the north, it obviously protects or keeps a watch out over Plymouth Harbour and the catwater. When I mentioned Fort Stamford just a few minutes ago, I didn't mean the fort that's there now, the Palmerston Fort, but an earlier earthwork which was on the site of the new fort over there. It was an earthwork that was thrown up early in the Civil War, lost in November 1643, flattened by the Royalists who captured it because it was too far away really to fire guns from there, so they moved them down to the seashore, and then reoccupied in February 1645, recaptured a few days later by the Roundhead forces from Plymouth, and flattened for good. Just going off the subject for a minute, you can see how Mountbatten also played its part in the Second World War with these gun emplacements here, anti-aircraft guns. William Batten was the son of a Bristol naval officer. His early life is a mystery. I've not been able to find much out about him. So if anyone has any information, I'd gladly like to hear from them. He is first mentioned in 1638 when he's appointed by King Charles I as a naval surveyor with the rank of captain. Once again, he disappears until February 1643, early days of the English Civil War. It's been going on for a few months now. Queen Henrietta Marie, Charles I's wife, came from Holland with a ship full of ammunition and weapons and soldiers and landed at Bridlington in Yorkshire on the quay where they unloaded their supplies. Now, fortunately for Parliament, Captain William Batten was in command of a small squadron of 4 ships. He heard about this Royalist ship landing at Bridlington and set off and arrived shortly after the Queen's ship had pulled in. Now, she was lodged in a house on the quay, and the story is that William Batten opened fire on the Queen's ship for 2 hours and bombarded the ship and the quay. They said he was bombarding the house because they knew the Queen was there, but there's no way he would have known that the Queen was actually in Bridlington. He then broke off the engagement and withdrew, and the Queen was able to land the supplies and transport them down to her husband in Oxford. Now, William Batten then once again vanishes for a few weeks until in March 1643 he's appointed second in command of the Navy, the Parliamentary Navy, under Robert Rich, Earl of Warwick. The Earl of Warwick came to Plymouth in 1644 with his flotilla of ships and Captain William Batten, his second in command. When the Earl of Essex was defeated, his Roundhead army was defeated at Fowey in September 1643, the Earl of Warwick in Plymouth panicked. He thought Plymouth would be next, which it was. The king marched his army overland and besieged Plymouth. Not wishing to be caught and surrender his ships, Warwick left Plymouth with most of the fleet and sailed up the channel to Portsmouth. But he left Captain William Batten in the town with a few ships. Don't know why this happened. He went, Batten stayed. William Batten shone. He helped reinforce the fortifications, the outer fortifications, with sailors off his ships because they were redundant at the moment. The Royalists did not have a navy, so there was no use for his ships to be fully armed. So these sailors were placed in the forts around Plymouth. He paid for some of the defences to be put up, extra defences, and he also raised morale. He got in with the council, the governing council of Plymouth, the mayor and the governor, and he really rallied the town. The king failed to take Plymouth and withdrew. The next we hear of William Batten is a few months later when Weymouth is captured by the Royalists. William Batten took 2 ships up to Weymouth to relieve the town and land reinforcements at Melcombe Regis, which is part of Weymouth today, but it was separate in those days. When these ships arrived, the Royalists decided to withdraw. So Captain William Batten, he saved Plymouth and he saved Weymouth. After William Batten relieved Weymouth, he went up to the capital and picked up £3,000, which he brought back to Plymouth to pay the garrison. This was distributed to the soldiers and the officers of Plymouth. Towards the next year, nothing much happened. William Batten was around, but he didn't do much. Because, like I said, Parliament controlled the Navy, and there were not many sea battles, if any. William Batten next comes to light at the siege of Dartmouth in January 1646, when Sir Thomas Fairfax marched the New Model Army down into the southwest and laid siege to Dartmouth from the land side. While Thomas Fairfax bombarded Dartmouth from the land side, William Batten attacked Kingswear Fort with his ships, bombarded the fort. Kingswear surrendered almost immediately. Fairfax captured Dartmouth within hours, and that brought an end really to most of the fighting in Devon during the Civil War. It went on into Cornwall for a few more months, but it was all over for people of Plymouth. A year after the war ended, William Batten resigned from the Navy. Not because he was dissatisfied, but because he wanted to spend more time with his family, his wife and children. His successor was not liked by the naval authorities, and they asked William Batten to please come back and assume his station. He accepted the offer, but by the time he rejoined the Navy, there was a mutiny going on between the Navy and Parliament. The Navy was dissatisfied. So 11 ships suddenly set sail for Holland, where they joined Prince Charles. He was exiled to Holland after the war. William Batten went with them. He was offered a knighthood by the prince if he would command his Royal Navy for him. William Batten thought over the idea but refused because he said, I cannot fight against my old friends, Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, and other naval officers who he came to know through all those years of conflict in England. In 1661, William Batten became MP for Rochester, but by now he was getting on in years. At the Restoration, he became acquainted with the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, who mentions him several times in his diary, but I don't think Pepys was impressed with him. In 1665, William Batten became very ill, seriously ill. He lay, they thought, on his deathbed, And I've got a quote here, what Samuel Pepys actually says about William Batten's illness. He actually says, "I am at a loss whether it will be better for me to have him die because he is a bad man, or live for fear a worse should come." A strange thing to say about a man, especially one he was well acquainted with, his whole family. He knew his wife. In 1667, 2.5 years after his illness, William Batten finally died in October the 5th. A week later, he was buried in Walthamstow. And Samuel Pepys says his funeral, his cortege, was accompanied by between 100 and 200 carriages. It's a very sad thing to think that people do not associate Captain William Batten with this area, the Mountbatten Peninsula, that has been named after him for what he did for us in the Civil War. There's not even a plaque to the man. And he fought here for nearly 4 years, and he did a lot of good for Parliament. It's very impressive to look at and see this great piece of rock, which is used for rock climbing these days.